Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today, despite the dismal weather outside, braving the rain and the traffic to join us for what I hope will be a very insightful day of discussion about industrial policy and economic security. Very pleased to have brought together such an extraordinary group of experts, not only on this panel, but on all of our panels today to discuss a topic that has been much in the news, I think, but also poorly understood both by policymakers, but also by academics who have been trying to unite the disparate fields of industrial policy, which has traditionally been a question for economists and sociologists and scholars of industrial organization, and economic and national security, which has been left to political scientists and foreign policy experts. And of course, looking at the world today, it's impossible to treat those as separate spheres. And pretty much every day, the number one headline in the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times is about an issue that unites those two spheres. And so the aspiration of this event is to bring together a mix of academics, of policymakers, and of industry experts to better understand the relationship between industrial policy tools and the securing of economic and national security goals. On the thesis that A, we need better theories from academics, B, we need a better understanding from policymakers as to what tools are actually available and what information governments actually have at their fingertips. And third, perhaps most importantly, that industry experts are just as critical as participants in this conversation, because the industry structures of all of the different industries that are being impacted by industrial policy and economic security questions differ dramatically and really do matter in terms of the effective implementation of these tools. And so delighted to have a series of experts from topics ranging from rare earths to automobiles to aviation to telecoms to help us understand the specific technologies and industry dynamics that policymakers will impact when they choose to deploy industrial policy tools. We have a full day of events today, but starting off, I'll turn it over to my colleague John Hay in just 1 second to kick off our first panel. But before I do, I wanted to take a moment to thank the team at the Mustafa Rahmani Center who have helped to put this event on, both my co-conspirator, Professor Summers, as well as the entire team at the center who have made this event so seamless and set us up for such an exciting discussion. So with that opening, I'll turn it over to John Hay for an introduction.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris. So thanks, everybody, for coming. It is an incredibly interesting topic that we're dealing with, which is basically two things that don't always get put together, industrial policy and economic security. First of all, I mean, a little bit of background. I'm the co-director of the Mustafa Rahmani Center with Larry, who's the director. I've been doing this now. We've been doing it, I guess, since 2011. Part of the reason I'm here, but though, is not specifically for that reason. It's that in a prior life, I was president of AT&T's international operations. I was senior vice president of emerging initiatives at AT&T Wireless. And so I've been on kind of both sides of this equation, seeing regulation, seeing antitrust considerations and monopoly behavior and how you address that from a firm perspective. We have a terrific panel today. One of the things that I've noticed when I've talked to people in the economics field, and I ask, how do you incorporate some of the geopolitical considerations, national defense considerations into your model structures? And the academic economists tend to say, well, we really don't do that very well. And then when I talk to the international relations people and I say, well, how do you incorporate economic considerations into your decisions? And they kind of say, well, isn't it like there's a Blackwell Harris book called War by Other Means. And they kind of look at economics as a mechanism to achieve some kind of national security objective. And how those two different fields blend together is problematic. And I think there's room for a lot of work. And hopefully these kinds of efforts and panels can help kind of bridge that. So we have three people here today. I want to introduce them in the order they're gonna talk. John Pelson is down at the end. He wrote a book, Wireless Wars, China's Dangerous Domination of 5G and How We're Fighting Back. He's had three decades in telecom. He was at British Telecom. He was at Lucent Technology, which I have some firsthand knowledge of, being at AT&T. And then he also was at Rampart Communications. And he has engaged pretty extensively in both the public debate and in some of the private debates. Mike Schmidt in the middle, and he is a distinguished visitor at Princeton University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Institute of Progress. But the main thing is he was the founding director of the CHIPS program office at the US Department of Commerce. So he really oversaw the CHIPS and Sciences Act development with somebody we have in the front row, Todd Fisher here. The two of them really have done an interesting set of pieces of work, kind of helping implement the CHIPS and Sciences program out. And then the last person I want to mention is Richard Aboulafia. He is the managing director at AeroDynamic Advisory. It's a boutique aerospace and defense management consultancy headquartered in Ann Arbor, and that's what he does. He basically tracks the aircraft programs, markets, companies. And the real issue here, if I go back to the agenda, and hopefully everybody has a copy and you got a chance to look at it, but the question on the table is, should the United States support ailing industrial champions? Interesting question. What lessons can be drawn from past decisions not to intervene? And we'll let each of them talk for roughly 10 minutes, and then I'll have some questions for them. And then we'll open it up to the audience so you can be tracking and kind of keeping your questions in mind. The one thing I would say is we'll have microphones, and you need to get to a microphone. We do have a lot of people online watching by Zoom. If you're not on a microphone, they can't hear your question. So with that, John, it's all yours.
Thanks, John. It was just last week that China announced an intention to withhold access to rare earth metals. And this was something that could not only hurt our industrial production activities, but could prevent our military from making critical materials from submarines to just field radios. We seem to be surprised to suddenly find ourselves reliant on a rival for something that was critical to our national security. But we've seen this before in telecom, and it did not end well. So how can we apply the lessons from the telecom sector to the role of industrial policy in enhancing our economic security? I'll talk about how we can learn from earlier failures and also what's changed since then. For too long, our industrial policy has been based on the premise that we're all in this together, that all countries are engaged in trade so that they can become wealthier, healthier, happier, nicer, safer cars, bigger homes, better education. Japan's industrial policy in the 70s and 80s was intended to do that for the country, and I think it was pretty damned effective. The damage to America from being subjected to Japan's efforts is that we got great Japanese cars and our own industry upped its game. That's not what we're dealing with here. Not all countries in the world have benign rulers who are looking out for their own people's betterment. There's authoritarian states whose rulers, and I don't want to call them leaders, whose rulers are driven by the desire to impose an ideology on not only their own people, but the rest of the world. And this means that any discussion of industrial or economic policy needs to be held in the context of one that accounts for the difference between business and war, between industrial policy and national security. I'll summarize the difference. In business, if you like your outcome in a transaction, then it was a good transaction. It's a unilateral criteria. If you liked it, it was a good one. In war, the metric is relative. How did you do compared to the other guy? You spend $100,000 to build a missile, and when that transaction is over, you're out $100,000. But if you've taken out a $10 million tank, the other guy lost even more than you did. It's a terrible business model, but this is how war is carried out. China's trade strategy looks a lot more like this than it does like business. That means that our industrial policy really can't treat things like this as just trade. It's really national security by other means. The CCP does not see us primarily as a trading partner as we've seen them. They see us as a rival for power, and they're intent on winning, even if it makes everybody poorer. They don't want that, but they'll take it. We can't look at them like Japan, South Korea or Germany in setting our industrial policy. So let's see if we got this going here. Let's consider the telecom example. A little over 25 years ago, Bell Laboratories was the world's dominant leading telecom equipment maker. And they were also, by most measures, the most important innovation lab in the world. And in addition to telecom, they were also driving US military. They invented sonar, radar, anti-missile technology. This was a real crown jewel of the United States. They invented solar panels, communication satellite, the transistor, and the chip. Other American equipment makers were also great leaders at the time. Think about this. In the year 2000, Motorola, Nortel, and Lucent were worth a combined $1 trillion in market cap in today's dollars. Within 5 years, they were all gone, out of the business. They were undercut by Chinese vendors like Huawei and ZTE, who were not just doing loss leading and trying to undercut them. They were selling at non-commercial prices for years and decades at a time. In fact, the government not only didn't step in, but the story recounted to me by Patricia Russo, who was then the CEO of Lucent. She said, in the midst of the crisis for Lucent, she got a call from the head of the General Services Administration, who does purchasing for the government. And the director there said, we understand that Lucent has a severe cash crunch right now. She says, oh, it's terrible. They said, okay, based on that, we're going to pull all of our contracts from Lucent. We do not want to risk buying equipment from a company that might not be around to support it, so we're cutting you off. That was the government policy, industrial policy decision when Lucent found itself in trouble. The government decided to let the free market play out, but the result was that non-free market, non-commercial pricing eliminated America's ability to build telecom networks for itself. Industrial policy is national security policy, and that's because our rivals are using commercial means to advance their geopolitical ambitions. So today, the big dogs are NVIDIA, Microsoft, Tesla, Apple. The idea that these companies could be out of business and gone in 48 months seems laughable, but it's happened before. It's happened before recently. And the question is, should the government protect them? And if they should, how are we going to go about doing that? And who in the government is going to fix this? What are the mechanisms that we even have in place? Think about who's responsible first for responding to threats to our national security. You've got the military, you've got the intelligence agencies, you've got the State Department. Now, the good news is these three organizations know that there's a fight underway, and they are single-mindedly focused on our rivals and doing their best, not winning every time, but they're doing their best to defend America's interests. But the last time the military got deeply involved in national industrial policy was an event that was called the Last Supper. It was 1993 when Defense Secretary Les Aspin pulled together the CEOs of the 50 biggest defense contractors for a dinner. And at the dinner, he told them that they needed to consolidate down to 5 companies. They wanted to improve efficiency. They did this over the next few years. The end result was less competition, less innovation out of the industry, reduced capacity to scale up in times of need, and less efficiency. Prices went up for the same product that they were buying. Now think, who's responsible for threats to our industrial and financial health? I would say primarily the Department of Treasury and the Department of Commerce. Problem is here that their mission, while it does include a national security element, is primarily about commerce, improving prosperity, increasing jobs. Go to the website, read their mission statements, look at how they're staffed and how they recruit and what the culture is. So if a rival attacks our national security via our commercial sector, we don't have in place structures to address even the problem. And China knows this. They know it better than we do. If we're going to create a path to resolve this, we will need Department of Commerce, Treasury, and I think other groups like Federal Trade Commission, certainly the Department of Justice, to step up and start playing a role and establish programs that unfortunately are not going to be commercially optimal, which is really counter to the Commerce Department's role, but it is essential. They will need to restrict American companies from buying inputs, for example, from the cheapest, best supplier. So that means that their efforts, only when it's an untrusted vendor that's supplying it, but that means that their efforts to do things like the entity list are not only going to be opposed by the rivals, but they're going to be opposed by their exact constituency that they exist to support and promote. This is going to reduce our wealth and prosperity. That's why it's going to get such resistance, but that's what war measures do. Now, one thing our policies can do to mitigate is just focus on policies that are addressing truly sensitive strategic industries, things like telecom gear, AI, batteries, biotech. Furniture is important. It employs a lot of people. But that can't be thrown in the pile, even though you'll have some constituent coming and arguing for protection for soybeans and furniture and for other things, because it's not vital to national security. And if it's not enough, it isn't going to be enough just to block rivals from our markets, because if that means we're coming to market with second best solutions, we're still not going to be competitive in the world. So we need to spur the creation of our own solutions by playing to the strengths of liberal democracies in general and America's strength in innovation and capital specifically. So for example, the United States can create a demand signal for needed solutions. So let the market know, for example, that the government is going to purchase, say, $20 billion worth of secure 5G equipment for bases and military installations, or $30 billion worth of batteries for a grid resilience program. If you build it, we will buy it. And you may be competing against Ericsson or Samsung in this bid, but you won't be competing against a Chinese company. Then let the markets decide how to fund this and which companies are worthy of getting the investment capital to solve the problem for that customer who just wants to buy a solution and isn't going to direct how that solution gets achieved. This type of industrial policy has one huge benefit in that it releases the vast investment capital that's on the sidelines right now. There's estimates that private equity and venture capital sector has about $1 trillion to $2 trillion of dry powder. And what that means is that things like the CHIPS Act really just become a primer to help get some companies up and running, but the real money that's going to pour in can come from the private sector. And importantly, this kind of approach is going to put the decision-making about who gets funded and how much they're funded into the hands of investors who are far from perfect, but they're much stronger incentive and ability for directing money to places where it's going to be most likely to produce a commercially successful result. So just in summary here, the role of the government in setting industrial policy should be first to identify the essential strategic industries. They didn't do that with telecom. It was not considered critical strategic sector. They didn't do it with rare earth metals. That has to change first and foremost. And that's got to come from really the top. That's both the White House and from the Hill. Second, they need to protect those sectors not from foreign competition, but from untrusted foreign suppliers that are not working in non-commercial means. And that means, it can mean putting in place tariffs. And I don't mean tariffs against cheap Canadian hydroelectric that's powering our factories. That's not what we're trying to stop from coming into America. Not even maybe from cheap components that we use for important products, but from supplies that are coming from untrusted foreign rivals. It means also enforcing trade bans. It means enforcing IP protection. And lawfare, we're going to lose that one because we follow the law. China has been less law focused. So we've got to really bring the hammer down for IP violations and enforce that much more strictly. We've got to pause antitrust actions against American leaders in strategic sectors if they're coming after companies because they've become too successful and powerful. That's exactly what we need right now in these key strategic factors. You can rein in and regulate a company that's abusing its power without breaking them up. And typically when you break up one of these giant companies, it's a sign that that company's time had come already. They were on the downswing anyway. They were breaking up AT&T just before the wheels came off the whole sector. They were breaking up IBM because IBM is going to clearly dominate the world for computer technology. Usually by the time you're regulated and broken up, it means that, that you're at the end of your arc anyway. And last, the government should become the initial purchaser of the products that support critical national security. We should be writing the checks as a customer to buy the output and prime the pump, but let the market figure out what the best solution is and how to really fund it from private capital. We can't let the country replay the telecom story with new key industries like AI and battery tech and biotech. But industrial policy can't be about picking the winners. It's got to be about ensuring that the country remains secure to fight the battle. Thank you.
Terrific, John. So there was nothing controversial in what John said. I think we should, get away with any antitrust enforcement, not worry about creating competition in markets, things like that. I'm sure we'll come back to some of that. Mike, fill us in on the Chips and Sciences Act and your progress.
And John, is this on? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. John, thank you for hosting us. Chris, Larry, thanks for pulling us all together. I think this is a fantastic event, exactly the type of conversations we need to be having. And John, thank you for that laydown. We on the chip scene, I say we because I have a bunch of the chips diaspora in here. We were kind of on the front lines of figuring out how the government can actually do this and exercise a muscle that the government hadn't really exercised for a really long time. So what I want to bring to you is a bit of a case study on how we thought about some of the issues we faced and what the future might look like for the industry. I'm going to focus on chips. We focus on a broad range of the semiconductor industry. So leading edge logic, memory, packaging, legacy chips, supply chain. Given the 10-minute time slot, I'm going to focus on leading edge logic chip production specifically, and happy to discuss other parts in the Q&A. This is not. I can also just signal to.
Claire, you got.
While we figure this out, I will just start. So chips, here we go. The fundamental purpose behind the CHIPS Act, driven by the fact that the US capacity to produce semiconductors has declined dramatically over the course of a few decades. Semiconductors are absolutely foundational to a huge portion of the economy. I think the chip war book says 75% of the global economy runs on chips. Leading edge chips are the foundation for all advanced technologies, including most importantly right now, the artificial intelligence revolution. We in the United States saw production decline from 40% to 10% overall in the industry. For leading edge logic chips, which I'll focus on today, we went down to 0. So our country produces 0 of these most essential technologies. Functionally, all of them were being produced in Taiwan by a signal company called TSMC. And then also what you saw was a corresponding atrophy of the whole ecosystem for producing semiconductors, the supply chain, upstream, packaging, downstream, the construction workforce, et cetera. The CHIPS team, over the course of a little more than 2 years, we stood up a program, we built a team, articulated a strategy, and we ended up doing 20 deals, basically. These deals provided $34 billion in grant incentives that would go out over time as milestones were met. And they were paired with an investment tax credit. And Larry, I want you to know I wrote this slide before our session yesterday. But the investment tax credit was a huge baseline subsidy on which we in the grant program were building. Nearly $600 billion in investments have been announced. All 5 of the world's leading edge logic and memory manufacturers are now building in the United States. There's no other economy in the world that has more than 2 of those companies. And I think relative to a lot of Biden era programs, CHIPS has been bipartisan. It was bipartisan in the beginning. The impulse behind CHIPS actually started in the first Trump administration. And with the exception of Intel, I think you've ultimately seen a fair amount of bipartisan continuity in terms of program implementation. Here's another visual that Chris sent me a couple of weeks ago that shows foreign direct investment from 2015 to 2019. So this is announced investments flowing between countries. It's a complicated slide, but maybe I'll just draw your attention to the little blue United States box or bubble on the left there. So this is 2015 to 2019. This is 2020 to 2025. So clearly a pretty powerful inflection point in terms of the trajectory of the industry. These are just announced investment though, and we know in the context of politics, announcements are sometimes not quite as valuable. This is actual investment. So what we have seen is a huge uptick in actual dollars going into the ground as a result of the CHIPS Act. Diving into leading edge logic, basic structure of the industry is defined by a few key characteristics. One is very intense capital intensive, very capital intensive. A single leading edge logic fab now costs on the order of $25 billion. Often these are tried to build out in what are called gigafab complex to create economies of scale. So if you build that out, you're talking about $150 billion investment, highly R&D intensive. So between capital and R&D, it's kind of like the industry is kind of like running up a really fast escalator. You just have to constantly be investing. And if you slip up, you're going to have a really tough time. As a result of that, there's been a drive towards concentration. So if you go back to 2001, there were nearly 30 semiconductor firms that were producing leading edge logic chips and doing the R&D to stay at the leading edge. Now, depending on who you ask, there's either one in TSMC or three in TSMC competing with Intel and Samsung. And then the other characteristic is the industry is highly cyclical, and the upswings of the cycle have been a huge part of the story of how the industry has played out. So one way to understand Intel becoming the famous Intel of old was that they owned the PC boom. Everyone remembers the Intel Inside chip on your computer in the 90s. Intel missed out on smartphones. All that demand basically went to TSMC, some went to Samsung. And now Intel is missing out on AI. TSMC is again dominating AI. And so that is basically the story for why TSMC is producing such a huge share of leading edge chips today. And in fact, today, Intel actually produces a lot of its chips through TSMC as well on the leading edge. We at the CHIPS Act had to decide. You have these three players. What do you do with them? How do you define we thought of it as a portfolio level strategy. And we articulated a goal that said we want two of them to succeed in the United States. We didn't say we want three. We said we want two. We articulated that up front. And then ultimately, we had a lot of debates internally. Does that mean you concentrate your bets on two, really try to make them successful? Or do you take a more diversified approach? We took the more diversified approach. So we now have Intel, TSMC, and Samsung all with projects in the United States. So I'll walk through what those look like. TSMC has a CHIPS Act agreement that provided $6.6 billion, again, milestones going out over time for a $65 billion overall investment. That's across three fabs. They've since said that they plan to build out all six fabs on their very large plot of land, totaling $165 billion plus two packaging facilities. They are producing 4-nanometer chips at yields comparable to Taiwan. That started at the beginning of this year. That was the first time in many, many years that leading edge chips have been produced in the United States. And last week, you can see on the bottom here, Jensen Huang was at the Intel Arizona site announcing that they are producing Blackwell chips in the United States. So that's the most advanced AI technology being produced in the United States. And really, this went below the radar, but is quite a big deal. C.C. Wei, the CEO of TSMC, said during the earnings call last week that TSMC intends to buy an additional plot of land next to this Arizona site to continue the build out, to have more capacity to build out, and is planning to accelerate the onshoring of 2-nanometer technology to the United States. So priorities for TSMC going forward: just continuing that pace of construction. And then what we don't have from TSMC is R&D for their process technology. And that would be a huge win if we can get that. R&D for process technology and really doing that here in the United States would be a path towards node parity, which is to say the most bleeding edge of what they're providing in terms of node right now that's still happening in Taiwan, then it's shipped here or transferred here. It'd be great to get as close to that technological frontier as possible. Samsung has a $4.7 billion CHIPS agreement for a $37 billion project across 2 fabs and an R&D facility in Taylor, Texas, as well as expansion and upgrade of their existing legacy chip facility in Austin, Texas. I think I would highlight on this, the commitment to an R&D facility, if it actually plays out over time, is quite significant. As I said, we didn't get that with TSMC. I think the big question with the Samsung project has been, given TSMC's role in the market, are they going to be able to find demand? They just announced Tesla as an anchor customer. Tesla has its advanced manufacturing facilities nearby in Texas, so there's a nice advanced manufacturing ecosystem emerging in the Austin area. So I think really what we want to see, I think it seems like the Samsung project is on sound footing, could be a massive project over time. Samsung is going to do a very meaningful share of its overall leading edge logic production in the United States as opposed to Korea. And we want to see more customer acquisition and a sustained build out over time. And we want to see that R&D come to fruition. Intel, everything's going great. So I'll just skip Intel. No, I'm kidding. So the CHIPS Act provided $7.9 billion for Intel across 4 states. It would supported a $90 billion investment plan. The Commerce Department subsequently and recently converted the CHIPS grants into an almost 10% equity stake in the company. And then as part of that conversion, they also transferred the cash. So instead of the money going out over time as milestones are met, the money is now on Intel's balance sheet. I'll comment more on that in a second, but what are the key priorities for Intel going forward? The CEO has made this very clear. For them to continue to sustain manufacturing and R&D at the leading edge, they need to get an outside customer, so think an NVIDIA or an Apple or a Qualcomm at their next big node, 14A, which is, think about it like 1.4 nanometer node. That is the huge priority. And then I think the question we have to ask as a result of the, and I put here kind of tongue in cheek, is share price appreciation now a goal now that the United States is a shareholder? For us, that was never a goal in managing the program. But I think that introduces some of the complexity of equity ownership. So to talk a little bit more about the equity ownership, it's helpful to understand some more background on Intel. So Intel has a market value that really is tied to its products business, not its manufacturing business. It's design of those chips, some of which it manufactures itself, some of which it manufactures with TSMC. And the foundry business, the manufacturing business, needs outside customers. It can't just keep producing chips only for Intel products. So the drawbacks of taking equity is that you convert costless grants into equity that comes with the cost of equity to dilute shareholders. So from a cost standpoint, it makes Intel less cost competitive. Its competitors are still receiving grants, right? And are producing in low-cost countries overseas. Eliminating the milestones, as I said, is a downside. And I think government ownership produces some very real problematic downsides. The upside is that it creates an opportunity for financial return for the government, which I don't think should be the primary goal. I think this is a national security program and we should be focused on that. And meanwhile, it doesn't on its face do anything to address the real issue, which is customers. Intel needs customers. So I think this gets to a broader point about industrial policy. And I think the point about demand signals is part of this, which is there are many tools for industrial policy. You have grants and tax credits and loans and equity and tariffs, demand side incentives. They all have downsides, right? So when someone says, okay, we're taking equity, we're making money, that's costless, why wouldn't we do that? Well, no, you're introducing other costs related to policy and distortions in the marketplace. And so they all have downsides. The question is, are you able to effectively tailor those tools to solve a problem and mitigate associated drawbacks? And I think that's why discussions like this are very important. So path ahead at the leading edge, I would say the two key objectives should be, we want 2+ manufacturing ecosystems, and we want to sustain and grow leading edge process technology in the United States. You can do that with TSMC and Samsung. You can do that with TSMC and Intel. You can do that with all three. The benefit of Intel in terms of these two goals is that Intel has its R&D here, right? So Intel's R&D ecosystem in Oregon is a true national treasure. And so for Intel to be successful and sustain that, I think that's a huge national asset that we should try to maintain. I think the tools that we used in the government, when I was in the government, I should say, are the implementation of these supply side incentives, as well as what you might call informal efforts to drive demand. We spent a lot of time nudging customers, and Todd in particular, and Secretary Mundo, engaging with customers to try to drive demand for U.S. production. But mostly that was in the realm of informal efforts. So I think the question is, more stick-based or hard-nosed efforts, like more coercive efforts from the government that negotiates on things like export controls or security agreements to shape behavior, tariffs, domestic or dual sourcing requirements. I think all of those are very. All of those are the types of tools that are on the table, and they all have drawbacks and upsides. I think I'm going a little too long, so I'm going to be short on this slide. One idea that's out there is separating Intel's foundry business from its products business. You split the company up. Could that make Intel more successful? We can get into this. I personally don't view that as the path forward here. I don't think it actually will help Intel get customers for the foundry in the shorter medium term. And right now, that products business is the cash cow for the overall business. So the foundry business last year lost more than $13 billion. So if you spin that out on its own, the question on how that sustains itself over time, I think is quite meaningful. Tariffs definitely have the ability to drive demand if designed appropriately. I think the threat of tariffs was part of what got TSMC to announce that greater ambition earlier this year. Although I think much of that ambition was already kind of baked into their plans. It was really about making that public commitment. But I think there are real drawbacks to tariffs. I think if you really apply them broadly on leading edge chips, you have consequences for the AI build out, because all those GPUs will then become more expensive. If you apply them to equipment, 60% of that $25 billion for a leading edge fab is equipment mostly produced overseas. So you're totally undermining your own objectives by making that equipment more expensive. And then to do tariffs effectively, you can't just tariff the chip. You have to be able to tariff things that have chips in them, because that's how we import chips. And the administration of that, component tariffs, it's really never been tested and is hugely complex and challenging. And then I think this is a huge stick that would create more diversification in the industry. That is a more robust dual sourcing requirement, where you basically say that for certain types of investment, they need to be manufactured with more than one manufacturer. I think that would directly address both firm level and geographic concentration. It would force Intel and Samsung to compete for number two, but it's a major incursion. And this is an incredibly untold prosperity as a result of the efficiency of this industry. And it raises the question of what if Intel and Samsung just aren't up to it? And what do you do then? So with that, I think I will hand the baton.
So something to keep in mind when we come back and start with the questions. Is this just a situation of you're bailing water on a sinking ship and you should just let it sink, and you achieve your foreign policy and your broader social objectives by building a strong base? Solow in 1956 wrote this paper on innovation driving economic growth, technological innovation. And I was a research assistant a long time ago for a guy named Mansur Olson, and he used to talk to me regularly about institutional sclerosis. So part of what we're talking about here is what's the adaptation process, how it's the transition process, and what should be the role of the government in shaping that in relative to the markets. Richard.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks, Chris, for inviting me, and Secretary Summers and the audience. Thanks very much. I spend a lot of my time trying to convince the outside world to pay attention to aviation. So really appreciate that opportunity to engage. I think before I get into the why is the hows and why the hell not of aviation industrial policy, let me just give you 4 things to think about. It'd be great if you could take away these 4 things, but hey, if you don't, like I said, we're just a corner of the economic universe. One is, yeah, ailing national champions. Oh God, we've had some issues, very high profile ones, particularly with our 2 biggest national champions, Boeing and General Electric. But both of them are very much on the mend. You know, been an extraordinarily bad first 20-something years of the century for Boeing, but for the first time, they've actually got someone at the helm who's bringing change and doing the right thing. And I've spent a lot of my career chronicling the bad things they're doing, as have other people. But they're on the mend is the important thing. One thing I would take away from this, from an industrial policy perspective, is that, you know, the wonderful saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture also eats industrial policy for breakfast. You can have all kinds of great ideas about the right policy mechanisms and funding streams to, well, rescue an ailing national champion. If they're run incompetently and with a culture that is not conducive to building and developing the right products, you might as well just pour it down a rat hole. It's pointless. So that makes me a little bit skeptical. So that's item number 1, ailing, but getting better, honest. Really, believe me. 2 is the whole idea of innovation in this business. It's not at the front end product. I think this is rather different. So much of the innovation and the value add is in the supply chain, in the aviation industry. And also the barriers to entry, they're high at the top, but they're even higher in several key segments, most notably jet engines, but certainly avionics and other key areas. So, you know, the Chinese have gotten to a point where they're developing jets. It's completely meaningless. It's Chinese aluminum over Western components, and with a far longer road to go in terms of developing those key building blocks. So that's number 3. Despite all the headlines, China's nowhere. If anything, they're kind of moving backwards in time here. In fire as a prime, as a market, they're great, love them. But in terms of playing a meaningful role, they're taking the wrong path, in my view. So that leads me to the 4th view. Autarky is for dummies in this business. If products and technologies, everything don't cross borders, you get the only aviation industry that's ever been created on this planet to go down an autarkic path. Many of you probably know it. It's the old Soviet Union. We're great. Oh, absolutely. As long as you didn't want to fly or anything. They had a kind of funhouse mirror image version of everything we built in the West, including the Concorde, Tupolev 144. All of it was crap. And when the wall fell down, all of it was trash. So the idea of let's make China great again with a Chinese jet, or for that matter, a MAGA jet that closed the borders, let's build an American only, that way lies absolute disaster. So those are the 4 things. Now, as my family will tell you, my love language is PowerPoint. So I've got way too many PowerPoint slides. I'm just going to walk you through a few of the highlights. First of all, why? Why do this? I mean, there are a lot of reasons, right? Why the appeal? First of all, it's a guaranteed growth market with high skill, high wage jobs. You can see the jobs there on the lower right, job wages, and you can see the market size getting bigger. It's hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's just at the top end. That's ignoring all of the support, the R&D, various elements of the supply chain that don't get captured. And also, you know, frankly, it's charismatic megafauna. People like supporting these kinds of industries and jobs. And on top of that, there is some bleed through in terms of national security because of the companies and technologies involved. It's an almost irresistible catnip for industrial policy, which is why some of the world's, I think, most intriguing forms of industrial policy have taken place in this very sector. I'm intrigued by that. So I see why people want to do this. And not only that, but in one specific area, the mid-market jet, Airbus is kind of winning. So there's a temptation, well, shouldn't Boeing be doing something in that segment? Spoiler alert, yeah, they should. Will they? I'm a little concerned that it's beyond the power of government to make that happen. Another thing is that we've been going on the same pathway. I don't want to call it path dependence, but in those tubes and wings you see at your friendly neighborhood Logan Airport haven't changed a whole heck of a lot, and they need to change because we're running out of runway in terms of technology improvements, which implies a greater level of risk associated with new technology development. All right, how do you do it? You don't even want to do it. How do you do it? All right, well, the cleanest and simplest way is direct R&D funding for technology development. And NASA's commercial technology account is a pretty good example of that. And it distorts markets least. That's good. However, it's global, right? You can support the creation of new technologies in various segments, say thermal management or fuel controls or whatever. Hey, Airbus and the Chinese, they're all going to have access to those technologies if they're wise enough to shop across borders, which again, you need to be in this business. However, then there's the big gorilla, defense. The other chart I point out, that's in the hundreds of millions, not visible to the naked eye in the world of defense. You've got the budget that buys weapons there at the bottom, and the budget, sorry, at the bottom you've got RDT&E, and at the middle you've got procurement. This is, of course, in the hundreds of billions. Now, you can do a lot with this. You can effectively prop up the balance sheet of many of the players in the commercial aero world, maybe with selective source decisions. You can put your thumb on the scale and give them a better chance. All right, there are a lot of people in the Pentagon who won't like that because at the end of the day, their job is to get the best weapon for the best price, but you can do that. Most of all, and this is the biggest concern, you can crowd out the commercial business. You go back to what Jonathan talked about with the Last Supper that Secretary Aspen did. One unintended consequence, another unintended consequence was that a lot of these guys said, hey, a lot more money and less risk here. Let's become pure play defense primes. Investors will love us. So Lockheed had a civil sector way back then. No, Lockheed Martin doesn't. Very few companies decided to stick around with the risks and uncertainties associated with being a commercial player, which is why we just got a few. So you got to be really careful using defense as a form of industrial policy. And there's lots of other ways. I'll let you read through. Some of them I think are really important. We discussed last night at dinner the importance of a talent pipeline mentoring program. Absolutely. Raw materials, establishing price floors and whatever else to encourage investment in things like titanium castings and forgings or rare earth elements, as we know. Absolutely great. So there's lots of things you can do. Some are good, some are bad. Anyway, here's the why not part. I'm good at the why not part. It's made a career of it, really. First of all, okay, Boeing has stumbled, but they're getting a lot better. And I would argue that if you look at the next 5 years, at least 10 years, it's going to stay a duopoly, probably 30 years. There is a concern with Airbus getting from 50% to maybe 65, but that seems to be something that Boeing needs to handle on its own, and they seem to be doing that. In terms of attracting capital, no, not a problem. Even if you go, I mean, yes, if you go back to the days of the 737 MAX emergencies that dominated airlines in the latter part of the last decade, you'll see a problem. Before that, no problem. Today, no problem. We went, and of course, COVID, yes, that was a problem. But normalized for those disruptive moments, they're fine with attracting capital, or even a hedge against inflation. People like hard assets in times of that. Now, this is another issue. You know, if you have solutions, create just new problems. For example, if you prop up the balance sheet of a prime, they might decide to take it out on their suppliers that are 85% of the value add of a jetliner. You saw this in the 2010s. That was an issue, a kind of moral hazard, I suppose. Anyway, there are lots of issues here. This maybe is the biggest. At the end of the day, when we talk about industrial policy, we're talking about a sovereign tool, a government deciding that, yes, we want to promote, maybe for valid reasons, our national industry. But everything that made this industry great depends upon multilateral treaties and institutions. So, for example, I personally believe that ACTA, the Agreement on Trade in Civil Aircraft, a component of the WTO, formerly GATT when it was created, is the best treaty ever. And it basically stops the world from doing the sort of thing that used to be done. And quite frankly, the administration now is reintroducing, like tariffs, like politicized jetliner sales, like demands for industrial work share. All of these are deadly for the long-term health of this industry. And we have become, the US, the first major signatory to abrogate this rather marvelous treaty. So when I hear industrial policy, I think, are we giving a loaded revolver to people who really don't have a good sense of what makes this industry great? Here's the hell out of me. Another thing is my favorite Goya painting. We all have our favorites, but the dream of reason and the dream of industrial policy produces monsters. It does. The track record of creating stuff with government money in this business is god awful. If you look at the headlines from China, we're going to be first with EV tolls. The UAE is saying the same thing. There is a US government subsidy program. Listen to me, I'm just, again, a corner of the economic universe. This is a colossal waste of time. Similarly, over the first part of this decade, I think it was the Europeans, I know it was the Europeans, who invested over $1 billion in a hydrogen jet. I'd rather feed the money to a goat, a really big goat, maybe a herd of goats. This is a really bad idea. All of these are really bad ideas, and they represent, I'm thinking, 90% of what's been pumped into industrial policy funding, a product development standpoint, rather than a building block standpoint in this industry. So be mindful of that, please. State capture is terrible, nothing you don't know. The other thing is a couple of really bad examples have been held up as good examples. Everyone said, well, it worked for Airbus. No. Airbus is not something that all of a sudden happened in 1970 when a bunch of European ministers got together and said, let's build a Boeing. No, it was all around from World War I. And they said, if we don't get our act together and cross borders, we're dead. We're going to be killed by Boeing, Lockheed, and McDonnell Douglas. So they created Airbus out of what was left of their battered national champions. That's very different from creating a greenfield site. Similarly, Embraer, they're really great. Two things about Embraer. One is they had the good sense to let their engineers shop across borders. So Jeffrey Sachs made the point, Embraer is one of Brazil's biggest exporters, also one of their biggest importers. Not only that, for every Embraer, I've got a filing cabinet full of miserable failures that wanted to be. A couple summers ago in Indonesia, I paid a visit to the graveyard of one of them. It was kind of sad, but really fun expedition. My family put up with me for that. Another thing to think about, China's doing really interesting work, unfortunate work, in the military sphere of aerospace, but in the commercial world, they're neglecting the one reality, which is that thanks to the really narrow operating margins of the aviation business, the airline business, if you have something that's 5% inferior, no, it doesn't work. It does not work unless you seal doors. Not going to work. Anyway, a few conclusions, and I'll turn back over. I'm reluctant here. I'm really reluctant to endorse any form of industrial policy because, frankly, it has been used in the past by cretins to achieve bad things. I'm not good at diplomacy. However, there are some solid things that government can do, creating new technological building blocks, mentoring programs to encourage the talent pipeline, and again, securing an adequate supply. But most of all, the two things that made this industry great in this country, one is working with partners and allies abroad. That means free trade. It means restoring ATCA, the Agreement on Trade in Civil Aircraft, so free trade. And the other is, again, encouraging the talent pipeline, so beating up on educational institutions. Yeah, really ill-advised, really colossally ill-advised, especially when there's a massive ramp up in defense spending that's going to take a lot of that talent away and indeed create inflationary conditions for that talent that will disadvantage civil aerospace providers. Thank you for your time.
So I think the votes are like 2 in favor of industrial policy and 1 clearly not. And so there's a lot to talk about. I tend to think of these things a bit in a businessman's economics kind of perspective. And it seems to me the starting point is some form of what is the market failure you're trying to address, right? What's the market failure? And it seems to me there are kind of 3 buckets of market failure. One is maybe the economic activity produces some positive externalities and you want to facilitate those externalities and there's a rationale. The second is there may be some kind of coordination or agglomeration failures and you want to facilitate the coordination function. I think I might put chips in a bit of that category. And then there's specific public input that may be valuable in terms of building just basic things like law and order, making sure property rights are respected, making sure contracts are enforced, things like that. So if you look at each of these cases and you think of it in what market failure is it really addressing, maybe just each of you take a second just to say, what's the market failure that it's really addressing and what is it good at or not good at?
So what's the market failure that the government industrial policy is addressing?
In the instance you're talking about with the telecom equipment.
Sure. The market failure, I guess I would challenge the premise because I think it's not a market failure. It's conflating trade with war by other means. So people say, how did, Huawei was a really well-run company. And it was. Great engineers. Ron Zhengfei, their chairman, is fantastic and use force multipliers of IP theft and government backing. And you can go from 17 billion to 130 billion in a few years. So you don't want to dismiss the commercial capabilities, but when you saw the ban on Huawei went into effect and it dropped their revenues by 1/3 that next year. I was at a company like Huawei that bent metal and had warehouses and factories and supply chains when Lucent lost 1/3 of its revenues. Mass layoffs, shut down all the pet projects, huge losses that we posted. Huawei, the year after they lost 1/3 of their revenues, increased hiring, had great profits, their margins were just wonderful, and they entered a bunch of new markets. And the answer is no, they didn't. If the government put 10 or 20 billion into them, you can post those types of results, but it's not a market transaction that's happening. So my argument is the policy is to step in when there's a non-market force that's acting on the American companies. Now, of course, the danger is every company will say there's a non-market force. How come their products are so much better and cheaper than ours? Clearly, they're cheating. Everyone will make that argument.
Right. I mean, the burden of proof, if you think about it in my mind, and the way I laid it out, is that must be some market failure that you're trying to address. And the burden of proof is to show that. But Mike, I know you're going to go down this path, I suspect, but on the Chips and Sciences Act, we were addressing a national security issue. And that's just very hard to measure.
Yeah, I think measurement is a whole different thing we can talk about. But I think the question is, does the market as it operates on its own fully incorporate our geopolitical and national security interests? Right.
Exactly.
And I think there might be some coordination issues that I think could play into that as an example. But I also think and I'm not an economist, but as I understand it, there are a set of kind of accepted market failures. And I think this question of national security as its own market failure is something that could use more development in conversations like this. I take rare earths, right? We start a trade war. China retaliates by squeezing rare earths. The legacy industrial players in the United States go to the government and say, we need you to cave on the trade war. And the government caves on the trade war. So you could say, well, those auto companies, they should have known that there was geopolitical risk with China. They should have spent the money to onshore or friendshore that supply chain. But when push came to shove, they actually were able to shape US policy, right? And so the casualty of that was US policy. And so I think this question, and when you think about chips and Taiwan scenarios, I think there are similar dynamics that you can very easily see playing out. So I think those are the types of models that it would be really great for economists to build out. And I'm at Princeton, I'm actually having conversations with some economists at Princeton on this very conversation.
You want to add anything?
Well, more on the failure, I think it's more on the supply side, but maybe the investor market side, somehow there wasn't the adult intervention that I think was sorely needed in fine governance and leadership. And I'm not sure what form that would have taken. Intervening in the weapons selection process from the Pentagon standpoint at that level, conceivably, although there are all kinds of complications there and already tempting though, right? I mean, it seemed like it was badly needed. Why didn't it happen? I just can't think of a way to do it. Failure of imagination on my part.
I do have to comment with regard to the telecom sector. With regard to the telecom sector, the biggest defender of AT&T's monopoly and opposing the breakup of the Bell system and the settlement that occurred was the Defense Department. And that was because we were running major secure telecom networks for the federal government, for the Defense Department, and they really didn't want to break up because of, and again, it's another version of a national security kind of argument that's very hard to measure. I think when Larry wants to ask a question, I acknowledge it and give him the floor.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and if you'll permit me, make a couple of comments. First, just to thank everybody. I think it's terrific that this group is coming together, and most areas in economic policy, I know what I think. This is an area where I'm very uncertain, and so I'm just very, very grateful that this is happening. A general caution that I would ask all of you to consider is what I would call the nuclear power financial derivatives caution. It's a feature of nuclear power and financial derivatives that you are very unlikely to develop expertise in them unless you have a positive attitude towards them. Why would you? If you thought financial derivatives were just a stupid casino, why would you develop a lot of expertise? Similarly, with respect to nuclear power. And so I am always nervous in areas where that exists, that knowledge and enthusiasm will be systematically correlated. And I would ask all of those of you who are enthusiastic about industrial policy to just consider that if you weren't enthusiastic, you might not know anything about it. And that is just a problem that any decision maker has to confront. Second thing I would say for everybody's consideration is there is a substantial body of knowledge which might be right or might be wrong in its current form on the subject of predatory pricing and subsidies. It is an old idea in antitrust. It is an old idea in trade theory that sometimes businesses subsidize to get advantage. Harvard subsidizes many students to come here. That is to the detriment of other universities that have less money than Harvard does, and they are mad. But most of us would kind of say that was a good thing. And so the question about subsidies is not subsidies. If I would imagine that if somebody would subsidize and sell us $12,000 electric cars forever, we would think that was terrific. The risk is that they will somehow destroy our industry and then gain substantial leverage, and we will then be at a disadvantage. And that depends upon what our capacity to respond is when they go from subsidy to the opposite of subsidy. It depends on what counter threat we can mobilize. I think it is fair to say that in the field of antitrust and business strategy, certainly the field of antitrust, the prevailing view is that predatory pricing is much more frequently alleged than something that actually takes place. And so I am not saying there are no predation-related grounds for responding to what foreigners do, but there is a long history of this being an abused argument. And maybe the best way to state it is that among laymen, among my high school history course, it is taken as given that John D. Rockefeller was a rapacious monopolist who subsidized to drive everybody else out of business and then screwed the rest of the world. And among those who study economic history closely, that is a matter of very substantial debate and might not even be true. And so I just would urge everyone who wants to argue about subsidies and predation to view the claims with substantially more skepticism than is being suggested. I am not saying that we shouldn't worry about it in any sector, but I do think we need to be a bit careful. Next thing I say, I'll just say two more things. I think that we also need to think about market failures that are also public failures. Here's what I think is a big issue that causes there to be a failure. Suppose I was smart enough, or shrewd enough, or lucky enough to hoard a substantial amount of a rare earth in anticipation of the fact that there would be an embargo and it would be cut off. And then my idea was to sell it for what it was actually worth after the cutoff. Would I succeed in doing it? Or would I be deemed to have been a bad speculator and asked to turn over my rare earth at some price well below a genuine market price? I would suggest that the answer in most societies most of the time is closer to it would be restricted. And so I think as we think about the market failures here, we also need to think about the fact that there are a lot of government policies and traditions that operate in the direction of thwarting traditional market responses and how those restrictions can be limited. A final comment, which I'd be interested in anybody's view on. This has been a fascinating session, and I've learned an enormous amount. when Chris and I were planning this conference, we talked about a concept for this session that involved issues that you guys actually have not discussed. And I just want to put that issue on the table because it's something that worries me. Sometimes a country has a really crucial company, and that company is being badly and unsuccessfully run. I would suggest that that was the case with General Motors in the early part of the 21st century. I would suggest that that has been the case substantially within the last decade for both Intel and Boeing. And there are probably other examples. A question that worries me is, what should a country do when it has a really important company, and that really important company is just doing a lousy job? And I'm very sympathetic to the view, hard problem. If the company can't figure out how to run itself, the government will just make it worse. I'm very sympathetic to that answer. I suspect that's what I believe. But I am also worried about these slow motion tragedies unfolding that are followed by even worse moments. And part of what I was endeavoring to do in talking with Chris about the program was get some really good ideas. And I got some better ideas on some probably better subjects, but I haven't heard any good idea with respect to that problem. And I hope at some point I will. Thank you.
So I want to follow up and give a specific example of the last point that Larry raised. And I'm going to ask all of you to comment. True story, 2003, there was an investment banker that I had used when I was at AT&T. He became a friend, and he told me this story, true story. 2003, Huawei and Motorola are in discussions. Basically the back and forth, and Ren decided that he wanted to be bought by Motorola. Motorola and Huawei worked out a term sheet for Motorola to buy Huawei for $7.5 billion, 2003. Ren was on board. He had the whole system on his side sorted out. The Motorola board rejected the term sheet. They voted against it. Okay, now this is an example of what Larry's talking about, where Motorola made it. They were a national champion, and they proceeded to make a series of really bad strategic decisions. And the question for the panel is, what do you think the government should, looking in retrospect, what should the government have done, if anything? Is that just the nature of the market working and you got to live with it? Or is there some specific response that the government could have engaged in that would have been productive across the board?
So John, I would say in that specific example, if Motorola had bought Huawei, they probably would have ruined them, and you wouldn't be talking about Huawei as the world's dominant player.
I mean, that is what came up, is like, will Huawei dominate and change Motorola, or will Motorola destroy Huawei?
Between Motorola's management and the lack of the government primer and force multiplying, I don't think Huawei would have become what they became. But to Larry's point, I don't know that I can cite examples where the angels in government created industrial policy that was enlightened and did exactly the right thing without favoring players. This is maybe an intractable problem to the solution that some of us are suggesting, and it may be insurmountable in that regard. But when you talk about things like predatory pricing, that's a business transaction. It's a legitimate way to try and make money. You're going to knock some other guys out of the market, you're going to take share, and you'll make more money as a result. And the concern is that this isn't a business transaction that's happening. So if Kroger's wants to subsidize food I'll take it because that's good for me. And that's their mistake that they're going to sell it below cost. And if they knock out all the other supermarkets and jack up their prices, eventually the other markets will come back into the market. And the analyses show that you can, in the end, make back the money you lose trying to knock them out. But if Kroger's goal is to knock out all the other supermarkets and then starve the population into submission, lousy business model, but pretty good for geopolitical pressure. And I think that's more what's going on.
Larry, I have maybe a question for you, just as I think about my response to this question, which is if General Motors had been failing and we weren't in the middle of an economic crisis, what do you think you guys would have done? Because I remember there being controversial around the auto bailout, but it was almost presented as a form of macroeconomic stability, given everything else that was going on. It was about the supply chain and the jobs.
Well, and there's a set of exogenous factors in that case, as opposed to markets working and you're deciding to intervene in some way unilaterally.
Yeah, it was just changes because you raised the example, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
We have a test case in a way. Chrysler was failing in 1979 outside of a depression, and the government decided to bail it out. My guess is that the government would have done enough that you didn't have a large-scale liquidation. If there was a private rearrangement where a bunch of bondholders were getting stiffed and a bunch of equity holders were losing a lot of money, but it was mostly a financial reorganization, there would have been no felt need to intervene. If there would have been a substantial liquidation where there was a reasonable argument that it was unnecessary, my guess is that the political response of the system would have been in the neighborhood of a bailout. Just as an observation, from that experience, because it came up occurred to me as I was listening to you, there was a serious conversation among the people who were managing that. Steve Ratner, who had the role with respect to that you and Todd had with respect to chips. There was a serious argument that maybe there was only room for two big automobile companies, and so the preservation of Chrysler was a mistake. And I would say a majority of those in the room with economics PhDs took that position. In the end, that was not our position, and I think history would judge that we probably were on the right side in having bailed out Chrysler as well. But you can certainly argue both sides of the question.
Just to offer a couple of thoughts. One is, I think that there are a couple of different models of industrial policy. The core mental model for what the CHIPS Act was doing was taking healthy companies who were going to make global investment decisions and encouraging to make those decisions here in the United States. That is a very different model from saying you have a legacy company that seems to be on a downward trajectory and what to do about it. And it's frankly a much easier problem to solve. And so I think the question that I think about in Model 2, which is more that legacy company, a little more of the Intel fact pattern, et cetera, is, are there a set of, if you deem that it is going to be important for national security in some way, are there a set of interventions where the government credibly can have an impact, a positive impact? In the case of an auto company, it could well be, like I think about the restructuring you guys did in the auto bailout, you were fixing the cost structure, you were negotiating pensions, you were fixing the capital structure, debt, putting it on a sustainable financial trajectory going forward. So maybe if the problem is financial in nature, you might say, hey, there's like a reasonable chance. If the problem is technology, if the problem is the 1.4 nanometer chip just isn't going to be up to snuff at the end of the day, and you are facing that moment, I don't know that that's a problem the government can credibly solve. I think that might be one that the government just has to accept. And so the question we have now with Intel is kind of this inflection point, right? The CEO has put the stakes out there for the entire world. If we can see it if we can get customer at 1.4 nanometer, we will do it. We will stay on this trajectory. If we can't, the United States no longer has a leading edge R&D and manufacturer. So I think right now we're in this kind of inflection point moment before we have to make the big decision. But if it comes to making that big decision, personally, in a fact pattern where it's about the technology, I'm pretty skeptical that the government has the tools to fix the problem.
So, but how critical is it to have Intel because to me, what you did was build a portfolio of companies that are investing in the United States. So what's an American company and what's not becomes a little bit more ambiguous to me. And so maybe it is Intel's a dying company. If they can't innovate fast enough, let it happen, and we'll build off of TSMC and Samsung.
It gets to this question of what is the value of an American company? And we actually thought a lot about this, and it was not an issue that actually had a lot of kind of conceptual, intellectual structure around it as we were confronting these problems. And I would say a few categories. One is that the intelligence community, defense folks like it. They like working with American companies. That was something we definitely experienced. Two is the R&D. Typically for American companies, you have American R&D. You see that with Intel. You see that with Micron. Micron's R&D operations here are exceptional. And then three, I think, is this vague notion that push comes to shove, there'll be some value in if you're dealing with an American CEO, right? I think that's like now what I would say is but my objectives on the slide, I said the manufacturing and the R&D, those are the objectives. And so I think the question then becomes, do you redouble efforts to get more R&D here from TSMC and Samsung? Again, I think we want Intel to be successful. I think that is a national priority. I think over the next few years, it is appropriate for the government to be doing what it can to get Intel customers. And I think, this is that inflection point. I mean, the Intel's R&D operation, it is a national treasure. They have incredible technological resources. It is in many ways an incredibly impressive company, notwithstanding the struggles. And I think it's a question of, can we use this moment to create an inflection point?
All right, I've done a horrible job of managing the time, but we do have a few minutes for if people have specific questions. There's microphones here, and here. I will say the usual, identify yourself and then questions, and end with a question mark.
Hi, I'm Christina Davis, professor of government at Harvard University. I've learned a lot from fascinating panels. Your discussion is really wonderful. You've talked a lot about market failure, where an industry or a firm is too important to fail, but you've also talked about how hard it is, bad management in top companies. How do we avoid government failure? Because you also expressed the worry about poor industrial policy. If our government reopens, what would you recommend as a better policy structure? Should we follow Japan that rolled out national economic security policy with a new cabinet minister? Is there anything you would like to see to make better government on these decisions?
That is unfortunately the hardest problem to solve, to have government that runs better. The whole model of America isn't built on how to have better government, it's how to have less government, because the idea is that to the extent that government's controlling things, it'll be suboptimal. And business ought to run itself, and things ought to be more, that's more of an American concept, is not looking to the government for what we should do. What I would say is we should have our government running policy on American principles. Don't say, look what China did, let's do that. Because if our policies are saying, well, they did this, they subsidized those companies, let's subsidize our companies, I think that's a losing game. China's a lot better at that. If we say we'll have whole of government approach, everyone, this is who the winner is going to be, That's China's game. It's not our game. So I'd say the government should stick to just American concepts and how they do pass policy, which is kind of perhaps a weak answer because, again, I don't know that there's a clear solution to it, but it can't be emulating countries that have very different models that they work under.
Just a few quick thoughts. One is long-term perspective and planning. Policy stability around long-term objectives is very important. The second is, I personally believe Congress has a really important role to play here. Bipartisan legislation is the most stable we can get in terms of policy direction for this country. And the CHIPS Act benefited a tremendous amount from its bipartisan origins and the fact that we really did try as we were running it to maintain bipartisan support and connectivity. And then third is particularly in the realm of discretionary incentives. So tax credits are different, but when you're talking about things that involve substantial discretion, it is hard. It requires tremendous state capacity. It requires sound governance. It requires discipline. Secretary Raimondo yesterday said it's easier to get wrong than right. And I think those types of things should be undertaken with caution. And we should appreciate as a country that it requires excellence in public service. And so when not to bring too much of the present day in, but when I think about the early days of DOGE and the kind of denigration of the public servant, I'm thinking about public servants that are doing tremendous things to advance our national security. And I think that, that kind of conceptual, I think we do need to think of kind of valorize public service in a certain sense, because you need that talent to do this type of stuff well. But I think it's really hard and it should be targeted and limited when you choose to do it.
I mean, it's a little abstract, but what I'm going to say, but it seems to me you have to play into the incentives of all the stakeholders who are going to have to carry out what you're trying to do, primarily and particularly at firms. And so to the extent you can play into those incentives, create the incentives that drive the innovation you're looking for, drive the kind of output you're looking for, then that's constructive. But you're not trying to substitute a government perspective on how markets should work necessarily exclusively for market structures. So, okay, Rachel.
Hi, Rachel Lipson. I'm a research fellow here at the Mosafar Rahmani Center. I think my question mostly for Richard, although welcome thoughts from others. I thought you made a fascinating comment at the end about the, if I caught it right, potential inflationary effects of the defense build out and a war for talent. Curious if you can share a little bit more about what you think the role for government, if any, is there. For instance, is the solution just the best role for government is to try to boost supply of talent in strategic industries, or do you actually see a role around better coordination between the commercial sectors and defense around talent? Like, would we benefit from a more aligned strategy about key roles and sharing talent between our defense needs and commercial companies?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I mean, look, inflation is simply a function of too much cash chasing too few things, right? And labor is no different from that. If you jack up demand in the form of higher defense spending, particularly for research and development, and you don't provide enough people through either educational pipelines or H-1B visas, that's the classic recipe for inflation. You also have the problem, and maybe this is the answer to your question, that defense contracts tend to be cost plus, and their allowance for inflation is so much greater than in the commercial world, which tends to be a bit more constrained by allowable inflation margins. Maybe there's a way of normalizing for that, the contract structures and what people can do. You go back to 1967 and the creation of McDonnell Douglas. It happened in large part because McDonnell simply said, we build military aircraft, we're going to pay everybody 10% more. Douglas, you build commercial aircraft, good luck competing with us for that. Here are the documents of surrender, we suggest you sign them. And that's how McDonnell Douglas was created. You have to be really careful, I think, with contracts. But most of all, don't ignore the fundamentals. Getting back to the supply, talent pipeline, in one form or another, has to be provided.
All right, we're going to have to hustle. So I'm going to take a few questions at the same time. We'll start here, and then here, and then try to get back to you if we can, okay? So just do them all at once and then we can pick and choose and respond.
Great, thank you. My name is Matthew Yeo. I'm a retired international lawyer. I litigated disputes before the World Trade Organization for 25 years on behalf of WTO member governments. Just as the United States has products that it believes that it needs to make in this country for national security reasons, China feels that way as well, as does the European Union increasingly, especially in light of the Trump administration. Can you envision, and this might be a little pie in the sky, but help me out here. Can you envision any sort of multilateral principles or rules that would allow countries to identify these sectors and to subsidize them or to provide supports for them to advance their national security objectives in ways that follow predictable rules and that are as untrade distorting as possible? Maybe even leave China out of the equation, just even as between the European Union and the United States. Do you think such a thing would be possible, and what might it look like? Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in. Oh, wait, no, we're waiting.
Yeah, we're going to wait.
Sorry.
We're going to get here and then Keith on it.
Hi, real quick. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Cheska, I'm a National Security Fellow at the Bell First Center. On that topic of, it was eye-opening when you talked about the Department of Commerce and Department of the other department about their competitive edge. Do we need to retorque policies to get our public organizations to have a competitive edge, so that if we have to shift over to this arsenal of democracy that was helpful 50 years ago, or even possible now? Because you said culture will eat your strategy. So do we need to retool our organizations these days to reinvigorate that competition sense to get that arsenal of democracy that basically won us 50 years, 70 years ago?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ketan Ahuja, and I am a fellow at the Growth Lab, where I work on antitrust and green industrial policy issues. And my question is mostly picking up on something Jonathan said, which was that you mentioned it was a mistake to let our defense contractors merge down into 5 companies, but then also that antitrust probably should not really meddle with our national champions. And I wanted to really tease out this relationship between competition and industrial policy and antitrust institutions kind of more narrowly understood.
Okay. And then last one, real quickly.
Arvind Govindarajan, McKinsey Global Institute. I'm interested in this talent point. We talk about capital and so on in various elements. How do we create the right demand signals and et cetera to create the right talent pool, which is often on a much longer time scale, for people to enter the right colleges, universities, jobs to actually implement our industrial policy?
Okay, lightning round. You can pick one or two that you want to comment
Okay.
on.
I'll go quick here. The demand signal, one of the ways to do it, and this also gets to the arsenal of democracy question, is you have to issue that demand and not do it in a way. Congress was saying, we need you to quintuple missile production. We need these, they're all being used up in Ukraine. And we're only going to do one-year contracts because we're not suckers in the government. So companies would say, we can quintuple production. We're going to have to build new factories to do that. And no company is going to build a factory on a one-year contract. So give us a 10-year contract and we'll go ahead and make the investment. So you've got to understand how businesses think so that you can do that. Just quickly to the question about antitrust, every company is going to claim that it is the national champion that must be protected and preserved. And so that, again, becomes an intractable problem. And you really have to have a sharp eye and say, this is an urgent national priority, not just a great company that's making great donations to us, but a company that really needs to be preserved for national security. And how exactly you enforce that is a difficult question.
I'll start on multilateral principles. I think the answer is yes. I think the key caveat came at the end of the question, which is excluding China. I think if you can get like-minded partners and allies together to create some kind of framework for integrated, resilient supply chains, I think that there's promise there. I think it requires enormous effort. So we in government talked about friendshoring. I had an international engagement team. We had very productive dialogues. I actually think the way the semiconductor industry has invested globally is quite rational. But I think that there is more that can be done to coordinate with other governments to advance collective objectives. It's something that looks very different from what we're seeing in the present moment. Then maybe I'll just talk about institutional capacity. I think two things are true. One is I think that the government has evolved a lot over the last couple of decades. So I'm pretty sure that when Larry was the Undersecretary for International Affairs, within the core policymaking apparatus of Treasury, that was the biggest organization. Now, if you go to Treasury, I'm pretty sure the biggest, certainly the fastest growing, is the sanctions piece of it. I mean, that is a massive part of the Treasury apparatus at this point. Similarly, at Commerce, if you go back to the Obama years, I think a much sleepier place, right? Now, under Secretary Raimondo, under President Biden, under Jake Sullivan, Commerce Department is at the frontier of export controls and industrial investment. So I think you have seen real evolution, both in terms of personnel and culturally. And I think there's huge institution building that still needs to be done. I mean, BIS is insanely under-resourced. And that's something I think the current administration has acknowledged as well. So I think both those things are true.
Yeah, I'll just focus on the multilateral aspect because, as I mentioned before, we got that, the agreement on trade in civil aircraft. And what's really interesting is it kind of created a self-sorting process. Not everyone joined after. It was just the people who were good and allied. So you had the Western countries, you had Japan, South Korea. China had observer status, but they didn't sign it because why? Because it would have required them to be less like the PRC. That was really intriguing. In other words, if you join this club of people who obey these rules, no tariffs, no politicized jetliner transactions, no demand for industrial or technological work share, you got to be like us too. We created this Western ecosystem in our industry, and it worked really great. So I regard it as a model, frankly.
The only one I'm going to comment on real quickly is the antitrust competition question. And we have some people here who really have expertise on China. I'm looking forward to hearing Dan talk about China a bit. But it's not that China necessarily protects its companies from competition. What they do, my understanding, is that they protect in the sense of from companies outside of China. But within China, the funding subsidies go out to the provinces. The provinces try to build these companies, but there is incredible competition. I mean, aggressive, cutthroat competition across all the different entities. So that's why you go from 400 EV manufacturers or auto manufacturers in China to 190 to, I don't know, something much smaller now with BYD emerging. It's not because they protected them against competition. They've just managed that competition within the Chinese market and allowed very, very aggressive competitiveness protected from outside, other than in the EV case. Maybe we'll have experts tell us about Tesla in that context. But I don't think the answer is avoid competition. It would be my bias. So anyhow, with that, I would really like to thank our panelists.